How frequently do we find ourselves trying to earn God's blessings, striving to receive His best when in reality God wants to freely give it? And we often find ourselves in that pit of emotional gyrations, trying to work out what am I doing wrong? What am I missing? Well, in fact, there is a better way. And today I want to share with you something mind blowingly profound and how alignment is the new mastery. And in a moment, I'll share how we apply the think, speak, act method to taking ownership. But first, let's look at this amazing story. God comes to Abram and asks him to leave everything he knew he was familiar with and step into the unknown, to step into faith, to absolutely demonstrate his trust. And he makes these amazing promises, and among them was that Abram would have an heir, a son of his own. Now, so long goes by, and there were times along that way that Abram tried to work it out with his own strength and his strategy. And working it out never works out. Now, none of that time was wasted. In the process, God was developing his faith, his maturity. He became a friend of God. But there became a profound moment when God changed his identity, that God changed his name from Abram to Abraham. And when that shift happened, when Abram became Abraham, when he aligned with God's vision for his life, 1 year later, he had the son of promise. Now, again, none of that prior time was wasted. But when he came into alignment through that name change, when he accepted who God called him, a year later, he had the fulfillment of the promise. And it's a recognition that God has already freely given us so much, and how rather than striving as we come into alignment, that we so easily receive. Now, often there is a kairos time, there's an appointed time. But rather than striving, Hebrews tells us to be diligent to enter into his rest. What is resting? Resting is when we simply and completely accept as truth, even if we don't see it yet, what God has said, what he has promised. So how do we apply the think, speak, act method to take ownership of this, to literally master alignment? Now, the first is think. We have to accept, in whatever our situation is, what is God saying? And what we see is, specifically we'll talk identity. Gideon's hiding in a cave, threshing at night because he's afraid of the Midianites. And before God does anything else with him, he declares his identity from God's viewpoint, that mighty man of valor who he would become. So thinking is aligning with what God has said, whether it seems reasonable or not. But thinking also requires us to continue in that. Jacob had spent his entire life scheming to get ahead. And there came that moment when God wrestled with him and changed his name from Jacob to Israel. And what we see is he changed. It changed his very nature. He wasn't scheming anymore. But we also see going forward, whenever he fell back to that old pattern, fear, whatever it was, that he's referred to as Jacob rather than Israel. It's a continual pattern, a continual practice of us continuing to embrace what God says rather than being influenced by the circumstances. And speak. Confession means to agree with what God says. And so when we confess what God has said about us, we begin to shift our soul man, our mind, will, and emotions, our heart, to align with our spirit man. That as we confess what God has said, as we speak it, as we personalize it, we're retraining our soul man to agree with our spirit man, releasing that transformation God wanted, that God has already placed inside of us. And an essential aspect of speaking, confessing, is gratitude, beginning to thank Him before we necessarily see the result, beginning to thank Him for what He has said about us. Because gratitude both blesses and honors God, but it also, again, that soul man that we'll define as our heart. It touches gratitude. When we proactively release gratitude, it reaches into the deep recesses of our own hearts, that it truly creates a manifestation in us. And then act. Now, I've shared this story in one of our books, but my friend Dan, who is one of our warriors, he had a moment where he asked God, he prayed, he asked God to give him a greater love for his wife. And as Dan would say it, he began to act that out. And then the day came when he realized he loved her in a profound way, deeper than he ever had before. That acting it out activated the process of alignment with what God so clearly wanted to see happen. God released, through him acting it out, God released this profound blessing into their marriage. So think, speak, act is the process of us taking alignment of ownership. But what is it that you need at this point? Do you need victory? Do you need transformation? Do you need to overcome? Or is God just speaking something into the deep recesses of your spirit that he wants to release through you? That it's a continual process, that as we learn to, rather than wrestling for what God wants to give, to understand what he's saying, accept and align with that, and watch it become a reality in our lives and in the lives of those around us. It's embracing alignment as the new mastery.